The Galactic Assembly Hall gleamed with the cold, sterile glow of holographic projections, reflecting off the polished obsidian floor. It was an amphitheater of interstellar politics, where the most advanced civilizations debated matters of war, trade, and diplomacy. At the center, hovering above them all, was Supreme Chair Zareth of the Voral Dominion, a skeletal figure with obsidian black exoskeleton plating and piercing silver eyes. He towered over the gathered delegates as he spoke. The Solarian species Zareth's voice carried effortlessly through the chamber, has petitioned for greater inclusion in intergalactic relief and defense operations. They claim exceptional resilience and adaptability. His mandibles clicked, betraying his skepticism. But claims are meaningless without proof. A murmur rippled through the chamber. The Hydros delegate, a being composed of shifting iridescent fluids, burbled in response. They are weak. They fracture easily. The translator embedded in the walls carried its words across the room. We have studied their skeletal density, hollowed in comparison to the Vorsics, fragile against the crushing gravity of the Ulanite homeworld, and yet they claim to be resilient. Ewan Markel leaned back in his chair, listening. This wasn't new. Humans had been part of the Galactic Assembly for nearly a decade, but real inclusion, that was a different story. No one trusted a species that lacked claws, hardened carapaces, or enhanced musculature. Even their closest allies, the Felinari, found them unpredictable, reckless, even. The Sivok delegate, a towering crystalline being, spoke next. Its deep voice rang like a chime through the hall. They are emotionally unstable. They enter battle with a smile. They grieve for the fallen yet continue onward. We do not understand it, and what we do not understand, we do not trust. Ewan exhaled through his nose, tapping his fingers on the table. He'd heard enough. Gentlemen, he said, standing from his seat. His navy blue uniform, standard issue for Alliance representatives, looked almost quaint against the shimmering regalia of other species. I get it. We don't have unbreakable exoskeletons. We don't regenerate lost limbs overnight. But we have one thing most of you don't. Silence. Hundreds of eyes, compound or otherwise, turned toward him. We endure. A snort came from the Felinari ambassador. Endure, the feline-like creature flicked its tail dismissively. Endurance is for prey. Ewan smirked. That's so he took a step forward, voice steady. We've survived on a planet that tried to kill us at every turn. We adapted to deserts, ice, disease. We went to war with each other for millennia, and somehow we came out the other side stronger. He spread his arms. So yeah, I'd say we endure. Supreme Chair Zareth raised a clawed hand, silencing the chamber. He studied Ewan with an unreadable expression. Then he spoke. Words are air. Captain Markel Zareth's mandibles twitched. The Galactic Assembly does not deal in air. We deal in action. A holographic projection appeared beside him, a planet, battered and scarred, its surface fractured by immense fault lines. This is Zareth, Zareth continued. A world of unstable tectonics and constant disaster. An Alanthan colony has been devastated by a planetary collapse, and relief efforts are struggling. The atmosphere is corrosive. The terrain is treacherous. Conditions are deteriorating. He leaned forward. If humans are as resilient as you claim, prove it. Ewan folded his arms. And if I do? The Supreme Chair's silver eyes gleamed. Then humanity will no longer be relegated to the periphery. Ewan nodded once. I'll be on the first transport. Zareth. The moment Ewan stepped off the landing shuttle, the ground shook beneath his feet. He stumbled, adjusting his balance as a plume of dust and debris erupted in the distance. The planet groaned like a wounded animal, tremors rippling through the cracked earth. The air smelled metallic, thick with an atmosphere that wasn't meant for human lungs. He tapped his helmet, activating the oxygen filter. The landing zone was a chaotic sprawl of different alien relief teams. The Vorsics, their crystalline bodies towering over the wreckage, worked with mechanical precision, lifting debris and stabilizing structures with sheer brute strength. The Sivok, with their 6 multi-jointed arms, moved like living machines, assembling shelters and medical stations. The Felinari, fast and agile, darted through the wreckage, extracting survivors from unstable buildings. And then there was the human team, all 6 of them. Hell of a welcome, Ewan muttered. His comm crackled. Markel a voice barked. This is Vorsik's Commander Yeklin. You are assigned to Quadrant 7. Stay out of the way of real rescue efforts. Ewan exhaled slowly. Understood, Commander. His squad was already moving. They weren't the strongest. They weren't the fastest. But humans never worked alone. While other species relied on their natural advantages, humans coordinated. One set up anchor lines while another stabilized a crumbling wall. Another carried medkits while another calculated the safest paths through the wreckage. Ewan led them deeper into Quadrant 7, scanning the collapsed buildings. His visor highlighted heat signatures survivors trapped beneath rubble. Got people here, he called out. Looks like a tremor shook the ground. Ewan snapped his head up. The building above them was coming down. Move. The squad scattered as the structure collapsed, metal beams and debris raining down like meteorites. Dust filled the air. Ewan hit the ground hard, rolling behind a fractured column. When the tremors stopped, he coughed, waving away the dust. Report. Denton's pinned, someone shouted. Ewan pushed himself up, moving toward the voice. Denton, one of his medics, was trapped beneath a slab of reinforced metal. His face was pale, blood trickling down his forehead. I got you, buddy, Ewan said, kneeling beside him. He glanced up. Other relief teams were watching from a distance. No one was stepping in. Ewan gritted his teeth. He planted his feet, grabbed the edge of the slab, and heaved. His muscles screamed in protest. The weight was immense. Impossible. He felt it pressing down on his arms, his back, his legs. Then movement. The slab shifted. A few inches. Just enough. Denton scrambled free, gasping. Ewan let go, staggering back. The slab crashed down again, sending another tremor through the ground. Silence. Then a voice. You lifted that. Ewan turned. A Sivalk relief worker stood nearby, 6 arms motionless, glowing eyes locked on him. Ewan shrugged, rolling his shoulders. Did what I had to. More eyes were on him now. Vorsiks, Felinari, Hydros species that prided themselves on strength. Watching a human, a species they considered weak, move something they would have used machinery for. Ewan wiped the sweat from his forehead, looking at his team. Come on, he said. We've got work to do. As they moved deeper into the wreckage, he could still feel the eyes on his back. Watching, measuring. For the first time, they weren't just doubting. They were wondering. Ewan barely had time to catch his breath before the next tremor hit. This one was smaller, more of a warning than a full collapse, but it was enough to make the already unstable ruins shift again. Status, he called out. Denton's good Lewis, his second in command, reported. Just a bit banged up. Ewan gave Denton a once-over. The medic was wiping blood from his temple, a little shaken but standing. That was enough. All right, Ewan said, scanning the wreckage. We keep moving. The air was thick with dust, laced with the acrid scent of scorched metal. His visor's HUD marked multiple life signs ahead, faint but present. They still had people trapped in the ruins, and the Elanthan weren't built for endurance. Time wasn't on their side. He keyed into the shared comm channel. Commander Yeklin, Quadrant 7 is still unstable. We've got multiple life signs beneath the wreckage. Any heavy lift teams available. A pause. Then Yeklin's deep, resonant voice crackled through. Negative. Vorsik's units are prioritizing Quadrant 2. You were warned, human. Do not interfere with real relief efforts. Ewan bit back his frustration. He wasn't about to argue over jurisdiction while people were dying. Figures, Lewis muttered. We're on our own. When aren't we? Ewan replied. They moved carefully through the ruins, stepping over fallen beams and jagged metal. Every few meters, Ewan tapped his boot against the ground, testing for weak spots. If the structure gave way again, they needed to be ready. A faint sound caught his attention, a high-pitched whimper, barely audible over the creaking rubble. He raised a fist, signaling the team to stop. Someone's alive under there, he said, pointing to what had once been a small dwelling, now little more than a collapsed shell. Let's move. It didn't take long to find the source of the sound. A section of the wall had caved inward, pinning an olanthan beneath it. The creature's translucent skin shimmered faintly, its large, dark eyes locked onto Ewan. It was shaking, its thin limbs trembling with exertion. Ewan crouched beside it. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice steady. "We're going to get you out." The olanthan's voice came out in a panicked whisper. "C can't move. Crushed." No one assessed the situation. The wall fragment was too heavy to lift outright, but if they could shift it, even slightly, the olanthan might be able to squeeze free. Lewis, Ewan said, motioning toward the base of the wall. "See if we can wedge something under this." Lewis nodded, pulling a metal rod from his pack. He wedged it into the rubble, bracing it against his knee. "Gonna need some leverage." Ewan planted his feet and gripped the edge of the slab. The olanthan whimpered beneath it, eyes darting between them. On three, Ewan said, 1, 2, 3. He pulled. The slab barely moved. His arms burned from exertion, his boots scraping against the unstable ground. The weight was immense, more than he should have been able to handle. But failure wasn't an option. He adjusted his stance, dug in. Muscles straining, sweat rolling down his back, he pulled again. The rubble shifted. Almost there, Lewis grunted. "Just a bit more." Ewan gritted his teeth, forcing the weight upward. The olanthan gasped as the pressure eased. "Move," Ewan barked. The olanthan scrambled out, its delicate frame trembling as it collapsed into Lewis's arms. The moment it was clear, Ewan let go. The slab slammed back into place, sending dust billowing into the air. Ewan staggered, catching himself on his knees. His breathing was ragged, arms burning from the effort. The olanthan clung to Lewis, its whole body shaking. I thought I was dead." "You're safe now," Lewis assured it. "We've got you." A movement at the edge of Ewan's vision made him look up. A Vorsik's relief team stood nearby, their towering crystalline bodies motionless. They had seen the whole thing. Their leader, a massive figure with a jagged, shimmering exoskeleton, tilted its head slightly. "You did that manually," the Vorsik's rumbled. Ewan exhaled through his nose, did what needed to be done. For a long moment, the Vorsik's simply stared. Then, without another word, they turned and walked away. Ewan pushed himself to his feet, shaking out his aching arms. "We're burning daylight," he said. "Let's keep moving." They kept moving. Everywhere they went, they found more survivors, some trapped under rubble, some barely clinging to consciousness from exposure to the toxic air. The olanthan weren't built for endurance. Without the proper equipment, they faded fast. And the other relief teams? They worked efficiently but cautiously. They moved with precision, calculating every action, every risk, and if a situation seemed too dangerous, they hesitated. Humans didn't. Ewan's team moved in where others refused. They crawled through unstable ruins, braved crumbling infrastructure, ignored the exhaustion clawing at their muscles. They pushed forward because that's what humans did. And the other teams? They noticed. They didn't say anything. Not yet. But Ewan could feel their eyes on him, watching, measuring. By the time night fell, exhaustion was starting to take hold. They gathered near a makeshift outpost where the rescued olanthan were being treated. Fires flickered in the distance, the air thick with dust. Ewan sat on a broken slab of concrete, rolling out his aching shoulders. His entire body felt like it had been put through a grinder. Lewis dropped down beside him, passing him a ration pack. "You look like hell." "Feel like it too." They ate in silence, listening to the sounds of the relief efforts still underway. Then movement. Ewan looked up to see Commander Yeklin approaching. The Vorsik's moved with the deliberate grace of a being made of living crystal, his glowing blue eyes unreadable. "You are injured," Yeklin stated. Ewan smirked tiredly. "I'll live." A pause. Then, "You carried an olanthan today." Ewan shrugged. "Yeah. without exoskeletal reinforcement. Didn't have time for reinforcement. Another silence. Then Yeklin said something Ewan hadn't expected. Show me. Ewan blinked. What? Yeklin gestured to a nearby supply crate, one of the heavy ones that took multiple Vorsiks to move. Show me how a human lifts something beyond their capacity. Ewan exhaled, stretching his sore arms. I'd rather not throw out my back for a demonstration. Yeklin studied him for a long moment. Then he did something even more unexpected. He turned to his relief team. Assist the humans in Quadrant 7. One of the other Vorsiks hesitated. Commander. Assist them, Yeklin repeated. Ewan blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected respect. He hadn't even expected acknowledgement. But for the first time since they landed, humanity wasn't being ignored. It was being recognized. Ewan pulled himself to his feet, rolling out his sore shoulders. We should get some rest, Lewis muttered. Ewan watched as the Vorsiks moved toward Quadrant 7, where before they had ignored human efforts. Now they joined them. He smiled faintly. Not yet, he said. We've got work to do. Ewan barely had time to appreciate the shift before reality forced his focus back to the task at hand. The Vorsiks weren't offering help out of generosity. This was a test. They wanted to see just how far humans could push themselves before they broke. Fine. Let them watch. The ground still trembled with the occasional aftershock, and the night sky was clouded with dust and smoke. Emergency beacons flickered weakly over the ruins, casting eerie pools of light across the wreckage. It wasn't much, but it was enough to see by. Ewan exhaled and turned to his team. All right, new problem. We've got survivors trapped underground. Lewis frowned. We talking tunnels? Not exactly. A lot of these Olanthan structures have sublevels. They were supposed to be safer during quakes, but he gestured to the craters of collapsed buildings around them. Denton swore under his breath. So what's the plan? Dig. Ewan shook his head. No time for that. We go in the same way they did. He pointed to a jagged fracture in the ground, barely wide enough for a person to fit through. It led straight down into the remains of a collapsed structure. Lewis stared at it. That's suicidal. Ewan checked his harness. It's necessary. A deep, resonant voice cut through the air. You intend to enter that alone. Ewan turned. Commander Yeklin. The towering Vorsik stood a few paces away, his crystalline form catching the dim light. His subordinates stood behind him, watching, measuring. Ewan didn't hesitate. Someone has to. The structure's unstable. Too much weight could bring it all down. Yeklin studied him. That is, unwise. Ewan smirked faintly. Yeah, I get that a lot. Without another word, he grabbed the cable line from his pack and clipped it to his harness. The others helped him secure the anchor point, double-checking the stability. Then, with a deep breath, Ewan slid into the fracture. The walls pressed in tight. Loose debris scraped against his suit as he descended, the beam of his helmet light cutting through the darkness. His earpiece crackled. You good down there? Lewis asked. So far, Ewan muttered. The air was stale, filled with the scent of dust and decay. Somewhere in the distance, he heard faint breathing. Hello, he called out. A weak voice responded. H here. Ewan adjusted his light, sweeping it across the debris. They're a small group of Olanthan huddled together in the remnants of a basement-level room. Their translucent skin shimmered faintly, their bodies trembling from exhaustion and lack of oxygen. One of them, a younger-looking one, wasn't moving. Ewan moved carefully, stepping over broken beams and shattered glass. You're going to be all right, he said. We're getting you out. One of the Olanthan blinked up at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. You came alone. Ewan crouched beside them. He touched his earpiece. Got at least 5 down here. 1 unconscious. Lewis responded immediately. Can you lift them out? Ewan considered it. The space was tight. too tight for a proper rescue harness, which meant he had to carry them. He exhaled through his nose. I'll get them up, one at a time. A pause. Then copy that. Ewan turned to the smallest Olanthan, the unconscious one. If they had any chance of survival, he had to move fast. He knelt, slipping his arms carefully around the fragile body. The Olanthan was light. Too light. He could feel their ribs through their thin frame. He tightened his grip, held them close. Then, gripping the cable, he began the climb. The moment Ewan emerged, the other team stared. Not just the humans but the Vorsiks, the Sivalk, even the normally indifferent Felinari. They watched as one human, just one, carried an Olanthan out of the depths of the ruins, arms steady, breath controlled. Ewan barely noticed. He set the unconscious Olanthan down, letting Denton check their vitals. Still breathing, Denton confirmed. Ewan didn't stop. He turned back toward the fracture. Next one. And went back down. It took 4 trips. By the time he hauled the last Olanthan out, his arms were shaking. His breathing was ragged. Every muscle in his body burned. But every single one of the trapped Olanthan was alive. As he staggered back, he saw something he hadn't expected. The Vorsiks weren't just watching. They were moving. Yeklin stepped forward, turning to his subordinates. Support Quadrant 7. The Vorsiks obeyed. They lifted rubble, carried survivors, moved with a sense of urgency they hadn't shown before. Ewan wiped sweat from his forehead, breathing heavily. Lewis clapped him on the back. You realize what just happened, right? Ewan exhaled. Yeah. The Vorsiks changed their minds about humans. And the rest of the galaxy? They would too. The night stretched on, long and relentless, but something had changed. The Vorsiks, who once dismissed humans as fragile and inefficient, were now working alongside them. They no longer hesitated, no longer kept their distance. They followed Ewan's lead. And it wasn't just the Vorsiks. The Sivalks started coordinating their efforts with human engineers, using their 6 arms to stabilize collapsing structures while humans handled the delicate work of pulling survivors free. The Felinari, who prided themselves on their speed, began using human coordination techniques, moving in organized teams instead of scattered individuals. Even the Hydros, who initially scoffed at human endurance, adapted their fluid bodies to reinforce failing support beams, something none of them had done before. What had started as a test had turned into something much bigger. Ewan didn't have time to dwell on it. There was still too much to do. By the time the final survivors were accounted for, exhaustion weighed down on Ewan like a physical force. His uniform was coated in dust, his muscles ached, and his voice had gone hoarse from shouting over the chaos. But they had done it. Every last Olanthan who could be saved had been pulled from the wreckage. Ewan stood near the makeshift medical station, watching as the rescued Olanthan were treated. Their translucent bodies looked even more fragile under the harsh emergency lights, but their eyes, those enormous dark eyes, were filled with something new. Recognition. One of them, the young Olanthan he had carried out first, approached him slowly. Their species was not one to touch, not unless absolutely necessary. But this one reached out, pressing a delicate hand against his forearm. You carried us, they whispered. Ewan didn't know what to say to that. He just nodded. The Olanthan turned and moved back toward the medical station without another word. Nearby, Lewis leaned against a supply crate, watching the exchange. They're never going to forget that. Ewan let out a breath. Good. The Galactic Assembly's emergency transport ships arrived the next morning. They descended in waves, sleek vessels designed for mass evacuation, their engines cutting through the thick, dust-filled air. Medical teams flooded the area, gathering the injured and exhausted Olanthan, preparing them for relocation. The other relief teams, Vorsiks, Sivalk, Felinari, began packing up their equipment, their roles complete. Ewan and his squad stood apart. They weren't done. Not yet. A damaged transport skiff sat at the edge of the wreckage, its systems failing, its stabilizers barely functional. If it didn't get airborne before the next tremor, it wouldn't be leaving the planet at all. Ewan stared at it, arms crossed. "Think we can fix it?" Lewis asked. Ewan rolled his sore shoulders. "We're about to find out." They fixed it. By the time the first tremors of the new day shook the ground, the transport was in the air, carrying the last of the survivors to safety. That should have been the end of it. But before they could leave, before they could step onto their own shuttle and return to their quiet place in the background of galactic politics, Commander Yeklin approached. He stood before Ewan, silent, for several long moments. Then, finally, he spoke. "The Assembly was wrong about you." Ewan met his gaze, but said nothing. Yeklin turned, facing his own kind. "We were wrong about you."
A murmur rippled through the other relief teams. It was the closest thing to an admission of failure the Vorsics had ever given.
Yeklin looked back at Ewan. "Humanity will not be excluded from future operations. Your people belong here." Ewan gave him a small, tired smirk. "Took you long enough to figure that out." Yeklin studied him for a long moment, then to everyone's shock he extended a hand. A Vorsic's handshake was unheard of. Their kind did not believe in unnecessary gestures. Ewan took it without hesitation. The grip was like stone, but not crushing. Not anymore. When he let go, Yeklin turned without another word, leading his people toward their departing ships. The humans stood there, watching them go. Lewis let out a low whistle. "So, we just changed Galactic